You must have been wrong for that.
Okay, so welcome everybody. We're going to go ahead and get on the record. Sorry, it's a little bit late. Are we recording? Thank you. So today we're here for a work session on AO 2020-619, broadly titled Public Records Update. Today is Friday, February 13th. We're starting a bit late. It's 11:16. I'll go till at least 11 or at least 12, maybe a little after 12 with this work session. We'll start with introductions. Ms. Baldwin-Day.
Aaron Baldwin-Day.
Zach Johnson.
Anna Brawley.
Christopher Constant.
Yarrow Silvers.
On the phone, Mr. McCormick.
Keith McCormick, thank you.
Thank you. We have with us Municipal Attorney's Office.
Joseph Busa.
And Jessica Willoughby.
I also have our attorneys from the Assembly Counsel's Office. We are joined by outside counsel, Police Chief, IT Director, and a counsel for the Police Department and the clerk. And Anna Plant is on the phone. So we have AO 2020-619, and I'm going to start this conversation because this has been a project I've been working on for 2.5 years. It is complex. It is a lot. There's not a lot of red meat in the slide deck. It just kind of frames the conversation that we're going to have. But really, the merits of the conversation happen in the ordinance that is sitting next to you. We do have some kind of notes from outside counsel on areas for consideration for last minute potential amendments. We're not going to get into that conversation today until the sponsors, Ms. Silvers and I and counsel have had a chance to sit and review the questions. So there may be some slight proposed changes between now and Tuesday. But before we get into any of that, we'd like to walk through the ordinance at hand. So first, the policy intent. And I'll speak to this. The reality is that our public records production and our records production in general, for some records that aren't necessarily public, has been frozen in time for a long time, and the world has changed. The way we produce records, the way the public expects records, the way the time it takes, the volume of records that we produce, it's all just fundamentally in flux right now. And so we took on this project to ensure that the ability to follow the state public records laws, federal public records laws, is mirrored in our code in a way that leans towards production, but also provides clear timelines and methods by which the departments can meet the mark when this code is updated. So really the gist is to modernize our public records code. So that's really the intent behind the project. You want to speak at all to the intent, Ms. Silvers?
So I joined in on this project shortly after being elected because open and transparent government to me is really important. It's something I campaigned on. And I really just wanted to make sure that the records are very accessible to the public. One of the things that we did a lot is we looked through what loopholes are there that a bad faith administration or government entity can use to withhold records. And we've seen it done in the past. So a lot of those were pretty obvious. Some of them we had to kind of look for and parse out. And how can we close those loopholes so that we can give the public, the best assurances that they can get the records that they are looking for. And so a lot of time was spent doing that. One of the things that was really important to me was, basically the limited cost for records that take less than 3 hours. And that really came up for me because there was a time when I asked for a single email and I was told that's going to take 2 hours. That's $80 for you to get that email. And so the 3 hours, it's really going to be hard to say that a single email takes 3 hours to get with a straight face. And so that was kind of a really important timeline for me, something that was enough time that you can't really claim with a straight face that simple records take that long to get. So I was really excited to join in on this project and just work towards greater government transparency. Thanks.
So I would flip to the next slide. I would note that the mayor is a sponsor on this item with both of us, and I don't see anyone from the mayor's office here, but that's fine. I think that generally speaking, we have the blessing to move forward because this has been pretty well refined. So the goals of the project are to limit fees for requests that take fewer than 3 hours. We went back and forth, free for 4 hours or 5 hours like the state has, or still leave the charge. And we kind of settled on 3 after a lot of compromise and discussions. Prioritizing electronic format and production, creating more efficient processes for response with deadlines and appeal procedures that actually function within the way we do our business, protecting confidential, privileged, or private information in such a way that the public records requests aren't used to abuse people, and to provide a mechanism for assembly members. Well, let me restate that. I think I would not say to provide, to clarify mechanisms for assembly members to access records that they have always had as a right to access, but have had some struggles with getting those records in the past. And so we create a more formalized approach so that you cannot be denied records you have a right to review in your capacity as a member. So it's a slight nuance. The slide isn't quite accurate. It shouldn't say public records, because if it were just public records, you would just follow the public record procedure. And so we're going to get into a discussion about what information was exempted. And I think I'm going to hand that part off to Joe. If we can go to the next slide.
Sorry, happy to walk you through some of the changes to the exemptions. And you can see this begin in 3.90.040. And here I'm on page 5 of the ordinance, where we have comprehensively set out all of the existing exemptions and then showed the changes that the draft would make. And there's a lot of them. I think I can just highlight a couple of the few big ones. The first exemption used to discuss only communications between people who work for municipality and the municipal attorney's office concerning pending or actual litigation. But the attorney-client privilege is actually much broader than that, right? If you're looking for advice that has anything to do with litigation, that should also be protected. So we're buttoning that up. B is our general personal privacy protection. Right now, it protects, quote, the financial and medical status of a particular individual, the release of which would constitute an unwarranted invasion of privacy. And we're bringing that to other personal information, because obviously there's personal, very personal information that goes beyond the categories of financial or medical information. And the goal there is to more clearly follow the federal FOIA, which has that broader personal privacy exemption as well. Moving on, there's a couple other smaller changes. I'm happy to talk about any of these to the extent anyone has questions about them. Some of the larger ones, if you look at paragraph H, I'm on page 6, there was a pre-existing exemption for information relating to collective bargaining. And the idea there is that, the unions with whom we are bargaining should not be able to use the public records process in order to get confidential information about how we're bargaining, our strategies, right? What we're going to give on. All that should be done at the table, not through public records requests. And the goal here with this amendment is to broaden that out to other negotiations. So for example, procurement contracts, people who are, bidding for our contracts should not be able to use public records requests in order to determine, for example, what our bottom line number would be in negotiations. And so that is the intent of that paragraph. The paragraph N, there's a well-known pre-existing exemption from the public records process when somebody is in litigation with the municipality. And the goal of this amendment here is to make clear that it's not just if you've named the municipality as the defendant, but also if you've named, for example, an assembly member in their official capacity or the mayor, so that any litigation with the municipality or its officers or employees would be protected by this exemption. Chair, I don't know if there's other exemptions you'd like me to hit on, but I think that hits some of the big ones. There's 3 brand new ones at the very end on page 9. So just to draw your attention to paragraph S, here we have an exemption to protect the confidentiality of confidential complaints when submitted to people like the Ombudsman, AR, the Municipal Attorney's Office, or AERC, to avoid, having our public records process dissuade people from filing confidential complaints with appropriate authorities inside the municipality. Paragraph T just brings into this comprehensive list of exemptions that already existed in Title II for the internal work of the ombudsman's office. And then paragraph U is meant to capture evolving case law. So when the Alaska Supreme Court addresses a novel issue and resolves it in a certain way, our code would now say, great, you can make use of the Alaska Supreme Court's understanding of permissible exemptions. Because this is framed rather broadly, it's properly withheld under Alaska law. The person administering this actually has to provide the person making the records request more specific information about why we are withholding this information. So, for example, citing the applicable Alaska Supreme Court case. And I think that's just an overview of what we're doing to the exemptions section. Happy to take questions on any of that.
Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, I have a couple questions on that. I'll also note, I'll just say it now, on item J, I see it's at line 35, page 6, it says substance abuse. I would recommend that if there's opportunity to change it to misuse, that's the more kind of current term. Substance abuse is considered a stigma language. Anyway, my questions are on the negotiations. I guess I'll start there. So item H, so you mentioned collective bargaining also. I'm curious, because negotiations, I could imagine RFP negotiations with a potential contractor, real estate transaction negotiations in a civil suit, right? There's a lot of things where I could see there's a negotiation happening, usually between staff and some other party. Are those all contemplated under this?
Yes.
So essentially, if because I know this happens with a bid protest, right? Where another party maybe, they want to know what are the terms be, or that they just get involved in that kind of business. So making sure that that's covered here.
Yes, so Member Brawley, the goal here is to protect all the information that traditionally and reasonably is considered confidential when negotiating with another party.
Thanks. And then is that, so let's say the negotiation is done, and the item is settled, whatever that looks like, whether contract is awarded, suit is settled, whatever it is. Do those then become public records, or are they locked forever? Because I guess is the protection the period of time that they're actively in that, or is the protection on the records permanently?
The protection would last as long as the information being protected would need to be protected for future negotiations. So for example, if we regularly engage in procurement of a certain type, and we have internal discussions of what our bottom dollar value would be for that, what we will be willing to compromise on in exchange for something else, we don't think that negotiators call it BATNA, the best alternative to negotiated agreement. We don't think that we should have to tell the world what that would be for the next procurement a year later, where the same numbers would be extremely valuable to the person on the other side of the negotiating table.
Thanks. And then another question, looking at Q, can you just speak to, and it's on page 7, you mentioned the 49th State Angel Fund. I'm generally familiar with that, but why is it being called out here by name, and why is that different than other entities, I guess?
So we have set out all of the exemptions so that people reading this can understand what we have and then what we're changing. Paragraph Q, this is just a cleanup. This is not a substantive change. This is a pre-existing exemption, and all we're doing is making it track the format of other exemptions. Previously, Q had led right into number 1, and now there's going to be a header similar to R, I believe, where there's a header saying, hey, if you're dealing with records of the 49th State Angel Fund, here's a bunch of specialized rules for that. All of those rules are remaining the same and being unchanged, except for number 4, Q4. We're getting rid of this provision because it would be unnecessary in light of the final section, the final substantive section in this AO that would give individual assembly members a right of access to certain certain records of the municipality.
Great, thanks. And the 49th state, thanks for clarifying that's already in there. Is that because it's basically awarding business, giving
Correct.
funding to businesses? Okay. And then my last question is not just on exemptions, but it was earlier on the definition of public record. I think that's helpful. So I'm going to give a couple examples because I don't know where these would fit. Let's say I make a note in the process of developing an ordinance on a Post-it note, which is just, I'm writing down AMC, or I'm making a note, or I'm handing it to the attorney. Can you look into this? Is that a public record for this? Or let's say a napkin or something where it's not a Word document. It's not one of these, but it is in theory part of the deliberative process.
So the definition of public records here is drawn nearly verbatim from the Alaska statute, the Public Records Act therein, and it makes clear that The definition of a public record does not turn on the format of the record. So if I document an important decision of the municipality on a cocktail napkin, that is a public record. That could be obtained through a public records request. Now, there's a separate question entirely about transitory records versus records you have to retain as a public record. That's not dealt with through public access to public records. There's a whole separate section of code that talks about what records have to be retained and when. And so if you were to write a transitory note that was not documenting an important decision, it's the result of that note is documented somewhere else in a draft or an official action of the assembly. I don't think there's actually a current requirement you keep that note. You could destroy it under whatever retention schedules apply or as a transitory record.
And then last question just occurred to me in the same category. What about, for example, mail that I receive? So let's say I get a Christmas card from somebody and it's not something that's sent through the clerk's office. It's not something that's sent to all members. Is there an obligation that we're keeping things that are sent to us? Or, because I know that's not something generated by the municipality, but then it enters City Hall, it's in my mailbox. Just curious about that.
Again, Member Brawley, I think that the answer to that question won't be contained in the public records ordinance. It's going to be contained in a separate ordinance that addresses when you have to retain records because you've been using them, and also in the records retention schedules that are revised and updated every year.
Thanks.
I want to offer, though, I don't know of any ordinance that's proceeding relating to that question. So what you meant is the code, really.
Correct. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, the
Yeah.
codified ordinance in the code.
Yeah, just to be really clear, we're not talking about an ordinance coming forward. Ms. Baldwin.
Yeah, thank you. I'm on page 3, lines 10 through 16, where the public records definition exists. Can you say a little bit more about proprietary software programs? That last line, public records does not include proprietary software programs.
Sure. So here we're just copying the state law on this subject. Excuse me, I apologize. The purpose of that state law, to my understanding, is to make clear that if we create our own software program, one might think, oh, maybe that's a public record and I can just get a free copy of it by sending a public records request. The answer is no. If we're creating our own software program, that's not a public record. That's just a tool we are using. And so it's not disclosable under the public records ordinance.
But alternatively, let's say if we're using a project management tool, if we're using project management software as assembly people, anything that's in that interface could potentially be part of a public records request?
I apologize, let's say, Your Honor, wrong forum. Member Baldwin Day. I have. I'm actually not familiar with your internal project management software. I would say if you have a document
That's it.
that you are working on, like a record,
Yeah.
then that's a public, and it meets,
Right.
otherwise meets the definition of public record. The fact that it's maintained inside of some sort of software program intended to help you keep track of records would not immunize that from public release.
Right, but they cannot force you to generate a record out of the system that meets what they want unless the record exists and isn't covered by one of the subject privileges. And so, right, if there is a project management software, a public records request could not require the generation of a record. Right? It can require the production of a record that was generated out of that tool, but it cannot make our staff generate your list of projects that has never been distributed. So,
Can
Jamie.
I just share an example? So we had a records request for the ARPA applications, and the ARPA applications were submitted in a web form that's put it into a raw data into like a CSV format. And so we provided it in an Excel spreadsheet, and then we were asked to provide actual applications, and we're not required to take that data and make it look like an application. Is that help?
It's part of it. And again, it's very narrowly constructed around records that exist. There is no rule under the public records laws that you must generate a new record.
Yeah, I think I was just thinking about.
Tell me if I'm wrong, attorneys, but I'm pretty confident that that's a true read.
I'll speak on this in terms of processing requests that come in this gray space when we keep a lot of data within proprietary systems that isn't easily accessible to the public, right? So you have the public asking for ABC, and what we have might look more like CDF, right? So I think in advising employees, like, we're not going to use a proprietary system as a mask for that information. That information still needs to be able to be made public, but it doesn't necessarily need to be in the ABC the requester is asking for. We give what we have. I think there's some challenges in that when, finance wants to offer additional qualification for what kind of information, whether it's draft or, how it's interpreted, or what kind of spin is put on it. But we can only produce what we have, I think, is what member Constance.
So I think, so I think that's helpful. So what I'm hearing is that like a screen grab of my like project management dashboard is not a public record that someone could ask for.
Doesn't sound like it to me, Member
Okay.
Baldwin Day, but the underlying information might be subject to disclosure, but there might be some available protections. So for instance, deliberative process privilege, which is now expressly recognized in one of the exemptions, says that if you are sort of in process in a project, you're working with some other co-sponsors and you have some discussions back and forth about what we ought to do and why, all of those deliberations would be protected. Now there's a time clock on that consistent with the federal FOIA. Deliberative process protections disappear after 25 years, as is appropriate, right? After some time that should go away. But your internal deliberations before a final project would be protected.
Plus, again, generally speaking, I have asked to be sent to myself a list of my projects that I'm working on. They come from the Department of Law and they will be protected under deliberative process and attorney-client privilege. They're not shared broadly. They're not shared outside of. And so there are any number of privileges. But again, to the core point, I have seen it a number of times. The response to a demand to generate a new record is denied because it doesn't exist.
Thank you. That's helpful. Yeah.
Okay, other questions? Nope. Let's proceed on to the next slide, past exemptions. Okay, so this is where that's 390.060, the next slide, that we tackle kind of making a more streamlined response process. Section 4, page 11. Obviously, we have a duty to respond. We will provide a receipt of the classification. We being any entity that is responsible. Now, there's a philosophical question underpinning this conversation that the Muni has historically provided that each department and generator of records is responsible for its own production of records. And we do not have a unified, like one size fits all approach or one department where you would seek records and then that person would go find the records. And that generates from a long history of how the Muni has evolved over the last 50 years and the laws relating to public records. And so we did not set to fundamentally change that system at this time. So there was, in fact, a policy decision you don't see because it doesn't change something, but the decision was not to completely transform and try to identify how we would fund and organize a unified command center for production of records. Each department has to do its own, but they are, generally speaking, on the administration side, all filtered through Just FOIA, which is a software program that manages these things, but still each department, some departments have the means to collect fees. Some departments don't. Some departments have staff to do this work. Some departments are barely keeping up with their workload, let alone going backwards to try to find records. And then that doesn't even get to the school district and how they're so fundamentally different than us. And so there is a kind of an invisible policy decision that was made, which is to maintain the system that allows each department to really be its own steward of records. And so I want to put that out there because I think that really does kind of roll into how the response process happens. So we set up deadlines for written acknowledgement. The acknowledgement has a deadline. It will set out the timelines for production of records based on an estimate. They'll have about 10 days to come forward with a work plan. If they can't produce the records immediately, there's a whole set of records that now would just be produced immediately. Is it a simple PDF that doesn't have any confidential information? Produce it. If it is more complex, they will have more time. And if it's extremely complex, they will have even more time. We set up procedures for requests to the police department and the other municipal agency, request seeking audio or video, and then commercial requests like production companies making videos kind of treated a little separately with some exclusions that are included in that section. And we also set up some more clear appeal and review processes that would provide immediate appeal to the assembly if there are assembly records, immediate meaning in the context of our next meeting, they can't command us to meet, within a very quick timeline for the mayor's office in only 7 days. And then there are a series of checkback appeal processes that happen in case the request is super broad and the project takes time to produce. But this, now we've eliminated within this project the ability for administration to say, this is going to take us 8 months, and then you not hear anything for 8 months. And then you get a letter at the end of 8 months, it's going to take us 8 more months. And so instead it requires production at a reasonable interval as the records are gathered. So you have a sense that the work is actually being done. So it kind of tries to eliminate the filibuster of the bureaucracy that we have seen in a number of ways. So I don't know if you want to add anything to what we've talked about under the response requirements that we've baked in.
I think that covers it, but I'm happy to answer any questions members might have.
And then Zach.
Yeah, two different questions, and I appreciate, I'm looking at page 13, starting line 32, or I guess in that category. I'm glad that this covers basically commercial use of public records. And I know this is the conversation I've had with two different police chiefs about, what is the, I guess from my perspective, how can we protect against our public records, essentially our public video? And I'm thinking of things like body cam footage, security videos in town square parks. So things that they're pointed in public places, basically being used for profit. And I know that there is a limit on what we can do because of, as this notes, right, these are public records, and I'm glad that this covers generating income. So I'm just wondering, are there other, I guess, additional protections or restrictions we can put on that? And then similarly, I don't know if, I assume public records are not intellectual property, right? We're not copywriting them. Can our public records be copyrighted by a third party and then therefore be essentially their, in some sense, their intellectual property? And I know that's kind of outside the bounds of this, but I think it's related.
To take the last question first, no, in order to copyright, you have to be the one who produces the record.
Okay.
Now, understand, if someone takes some of our records and then mixes them up, adds music, adds some interstitial voiceover, all those elements they are adding will be copyright protected because they're the ones creating them. But as the creators of the records, the person who receives them would not thereby have copyright to the entire raw video. To address your first question about limitations on commercial use, that's a real concern. It's something we discussed at great length when we were going over this. There have been some real requests where people have asked, give me everything you have on, sort of salacious crime X. And that can be extremely time consuming to respond to. You can be talking about thousands and thousands of records, lots of body cam video, and a lot of very sensitive information contained therein that you actually don't want to be releasing to the public, right? The identities of innocent third parties, especially children, you'd have to go through and redact all of that information. And so that is very time consuming. There's a couple limitations here. One, as you noted, here on page 13, commercial requesters aren't exactly getting priority access, right? They're getting their timelines all doubled. Two, there's the fee section, which we didn't address directly, but that's section 3 of the ordinance, and you can look at that starting on page 9 through 11, where we're still authorized to charge the full actual cost to the municipality of producing records. So if it does in fact take months and months and months of multiple personnel time to produce some of those records, we'll be able to charge full freight for all of that to make sure that the commercial requester is not, making use of taxpayer funds for free to get their raw materials for their own commercial product. And then finally, there is the requirement at the front end that, I'll just draw your attention to page 11, for example, paragraph A, where it talks about the importance of working with the requester to clarify or narrow requests. Sometimes we do find that requesters will toss in a request that in fact is extremely broad, might be very difficult to deal with, but in fact, they're only looking for a tiny subset of information. And if we can work with them to identify what the tiny subset is, they can save everybody a lot of time and effort and still get the requester exactly what they're looking for. And so that procedure is built in there in paragraph A as well.
Follow up on that. Is there, I don't know if this is common or if this is what anybody does, but is it possible basically for an entity to attempt to enter into a contractual relationship or an ongoing, basically where we are continuing to give them footage on an ongoing basis? And again, I'm thinking of TV shows, Cops is the old one, there's new ones, so where you basically are saying like, I intend to get, 10,000 hours of footage or something like that. Is there anything prohibiting that? Is there any precedent of that? And I know that's probably a research question, but I'm just curious, like I'm trying to think of how these companies might operate.
So off the top of my head, I don't know of anything prohibiting us from entering into a contract with a commercial provider if they would like to pay us for access to some records that would help them. I guess I could imagine such a transaction. I don't know of a provision of code that would prohibit it. And the last thing I should toss out, because I forgot to do it in our first colloquy, there's also a provision allowing, in lieu of the, produce it within 45 days or else deadline, if there's a large project, you can actually come up with a production schedule with the other side, so that instead of 45 days, give us everything. If someone's asking for the entire investigative file, it's going to be, we're talking 4 people working nonstop for several months to produce the entire thing, we could set a reasonable production schedule that might have it a year out.
And then, sorry, one other quick question, separate topic. I noticed multiple places where this basically gives small A agency to the school district, and then some purview to the school board to make decisions. I'm just curious in general, like, because I know they're a separate entity, but how do we in our code regulate the school district essentially?
Well, currently, if memory serves, the current public records law, codified in 3.90, does apply to the school district. And so that's not a change here.
Right.
What we are doing here is giving the school district necessary flexibility for their own operational needs. And we did that in consultation with the chief operating officer from the school district.
Okay, thanks.
Yara, you want to add?
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit to that. I mean, one of the issues with requiring the school district to follow our timelines is a lot of the teachers are laid off right through the summer. And so if a teacher that's laid off, that's not employed at the time, gets a records request, we're not going to fill that in 10 days, or they're not going to fill that in 10 days, even if it's just, an email. That's going to be filled when they are back on staff again in the fall. And so that was kind of the problem with us setting the time schedule for the school district. And so that's why they are going to need to do that.
Yeah, and I'll clarify, I support that and I understand it's not a change. It's more just in general, it's helpful to understand kind of what we can and can't regulate at the school district.
Yeah, and I think that I will add that we definitely could have gone down more of that road, but this project took 2.5 years, and we only got to a point within the municipality where there was unification around the concept. And as soon as you unpack, what about the school district? That could be another year of back and forth for us or more, getting to the point where there's a agreement with them on how their processes should work. And so this is like the easy button in a way in which we say, you guys, you have to have a policy that comports with the law, but we're not going to tell you what it is. And so, and they know that because it's the law, but anyhow, I hate to say that was one reason why as well. They have different inputs, they have different outputs, different timelines. And we realized we could not tell them meaningfully without lots of diving in the process with them. So I would offer a question on the copyright. Do we watermark videos that go out? Do we know?
I mean, the chief can speak if he wants to clarify me on this, but every single body-worn camera or dash cam video I've ever seen has a watermark specifying the exact camera it was taken from and the timestamp indicating this is ours.
Yeah, and I want to make sure for producing, I don't think it needs to be in the code, but that if we're talking security cameras or traffic cameras, there's something that identifies it as a municipal kind of element.
Sorry to interrupt you, Chair. Every traffic cam video I've seen has a time, date, and location stamp. So it's telling you this is like Tudor.
But that might not actually say time, date, and location whose it is, right?
That's true. I would just caution, it is something to think about. Yeah. I do wonder if you add a new requirement that we have to add a watermark to every single thing, you're just going to add staff time in producing.
Right. And so my argument there is not that we should look at that in the code, but the administration should look at that as a practical measure relating to how we identify whose records are whose. And so I don't want to put it on this project. Zach?
Yeah, thank you. I have a couple questions, and I think I'll start with a caveat that these are probably questions for a later day, but sort of come to mind looking at this. And it's in regards to this section, but what I'm actually looking at is the C at the end of this. And two sort of questions, potential concerns that come up here is one, it mentions that for APD with current staffing levels, that we anticipate the need to request frequent extensions. And I kind of understand how maybe as a practical matter that makes sense. But, you know, I get that we want to have the goal or aspiration of always getting records turned around in a timely manner. But if we're sort of conceding from the get-go, like, look, we don't think we're going to be able to meet these goals, I worry about, you know, I mean, are we creating false expectations perhaps in the public's view when we say, we think here's the goal we're going to advertise for you, but there's no way we're actually going to meet it.
So I'm going to speak to that. There were some very passionate debates on the question of the statement of economic effects. The only clear and true economic effect that I was willing to concede in that document was the loss of revenue that could be demonstrated by the fact that we're going to provide some free time. There was a kind of 90-yard line presentation of, well, we need $300,000 for more staff at APD to do this if you're going to pass this, at which point I almost had a stroke because we just passed a massive increase of our generation of records through the real-time crime center with all license plate reading documents, and we increased $12 million worth of generating records without being put forward the idea under that huge rubric and expense that we might need some more people to process records. And so it was offensive to me deeply that we would, just after that whole conversation where we expand the capacity of the generation of records, that we didn't do anything in that project that is the generator of cost and increased records to account for the increased potential of needing to produce records to the public. And so what exists in the C is a bit of a compromise in which it calls out that the police department believes it's going to take more staff time to address public records under this new set of rules. And I just frankly wasn't going to have it sink this project at this time because too much has been invested to get it here. And so from my perspective, that's kind of as diplomatically as I could put that very spicy conversation or conversations that we had, why this document reads the way it does. And it is a concern. And I think I'll let Joe, if he wants to add anything to that, speak to that. Because if we do see an exponential increase or a broader increase of records requests, it's going to take more staff. That's a 1 + 1 = 2. It's arithmetic. So
you asked about expectations, and I think it's important for people to realize that yes, we are creating deadlines. You know, the current code just says reasonable time, no specific deadline. One of the major goals of this project was to create specific deadlines, but there has to be a safety valve for those deadlines when people are understaffed, the person who produces records in a specific department is out for 20 days, whatever. So there is an extension provision in the code. So I wouldn't say that, you know, making use of the extension provision that is in the code where appropriate, if there is understaffing in the department for a particular period of time, I don't think that's, I think people should understand that that is sort of meeting expectations, right? And whether people are appropriately staffed in order to meet the deadlines without the extensions is really just a budgeting question, right? That's for this body working in conjunction with OMB and the mayor and APD. And the other thing I would say is it's not as if the extensions are toothless. I think if you read the extension provision carefully, you'll see that on a second or subsequent extension, it actually gives a right of internal administrative appeal. So for example, if a requester thinks, this extension, I don't think it's really because of lack of resources. I have other thoughts that maybe I'm just being stonewalled here. They can raise that to an appropriately high level of administration, right? The mayor's office can then look at that appeal and look into the situation, right? So that's an important internal administrative check on overuse of extensions.
also we provide at that point the opportunity to go to the Superior Court if you need it, if you feel like you're not being heard. Jessica?
Can I also add, I think in current code, it can be challenging to help incentivize people from targeting their requests when they come in with, you know, really broad language. And the only tool that's provided right now in code is providing an estimate. So you end up with this unwieldy estimate. So with that kind of structured approach, you can help folks understand that, hey, if you're looking for a specific document, I can get that to you in this timeline. But if you're going to ask for this huge amount, it's going to take much longer. And in theory, that's what's happening now, but it's not as articulated to the public.
Okay, yeah, it's some interesting questions there, right? And I understand we want to have some checks. We want to offer people some recourse, you know, if they feel like they are getting stonewalled or something like that. But again, I mean, if we're sort of saying, you know, you from the get-go, when you file a request, you can anticipate a response in 10 days, but 90% of the time we're telling them, you know, at the end of the 10 days, no, we can't. Here's why. I mean, if that's sort of, if we sort of can understand, you know, looking inward that we don't have the staff to meet those expectations, but the public says, aha, now I feel as if I am getting stonewalled and I'm going to move this up the chain. I mean, now we're just talking about committing more resources to make sure that we're providing them with the correct response. And I mean, I feel like in a more perfect world, they would just say like, well, let's hire some additional staff to meet those requirements. But we know that we are fiscally constrained here. So I'm not arguing for a specific fix at this point, but I think we need to be mindful of that, because if we set an expectation and we say we don't actually anticipate meeting that goal the vast majority of the time, that feels a little problematic. And then the other piece of this that I'd be curious to see what happens is, I certainly understand why it's nice to reduce these fees. Like, you know, I'm all for transparency and then, you know, making the process easier for the public. But I mean, the question is, what effect is that going to have on the number of requests we get, right? Because if people suddenly figure out that there's no cost to them to start doing this, I mean, do they start hitting us with more and more requests? And is that going to start to take what feels like already sort of a problematic situation and make it considerably worse? And I don't know. I don't want to speculate too much
could
about
speak
that
briefly
now,
to
but
that.
I would be
So
curious.
we did actually set up, much like the 10-cent fee on a plastic bag, a $10 fee to file a records request. So and that number is flexible. There's still some debate about the value of that, but the idea of some kind of limited barrier to entry, like an intentional, you got to have a little skin in the game, and it could be waived, I'm sure, by if somebody pleads poverty and comes in, but $10 is pretty de minimis relative to the problem. We did work to counter that problem of broad requests coming in and frequently, just to bog the system down by at least adding that. And I don't know where you came up with the 90% number. Probably just random, but I don't believe in that there is a universe in which 90% of the records requests would find themselves in a perpetual cycle of delay. I think it would be a much lower number. And generally speaking, probably the larger requests that have that more intense demand for either redactions, reviews, all of the things that would go into that. And so, and here's what I think the real answer to your question is. The real answer is, let's get these things in place and let's measure the responsiveness, the rates of how frequently we're getting them, and then benchmark the need for staffing on reality, not on wild ass guesses. And so for members of the assembly going forward, really, after you pass a major code change, you have to monitor it. Did we break anything? Because sometimes that happens. And one of the monitoring processes would be, you know, did we hit the mark? Are we seeing the same, less, more requests? Are we meeting the timelines? What's the stick point? How can we fix that? So this is a major update that will likely need secondary review once it's real world tested.
And I think that I'm previewing that. I'm interested in having that conversation once we see what the results are. And just to also say that more staff is not always going to be an option for us, unfortunately.
And if I could just extend, Mr. Chair, there's also provision in here that makes clear that was already implicitly true, but just makes doubly clear where automation tools exist and can be appropriately used, that they can be used, right? So as we're moving towards a world in which maybe it's possible to find, you know, that public records requests can be screened for, oh, this is like a set of public records requests that we can actually produce fairly easily using an automated tool in order to focus staff time on the more difficult set of public records requests. So that is the hope.
And one of my sad unfinished lines of business on the kind of platform of open records as opposed to records production is that I would like to see, and I'm just not going to be here for it, and it's a major undertaking, the general publication of all kind of records that are requested frequently that should just be available to the public if it exists in the form of a PDF on somebody's desktop. What comes to mind very specifically are all of the contracts and purchasing documents that are approved, and we only see the memo with the general terms except for those that have very specific redactions for business practices that are confidential or the things, those PDFs should just exist in a place where I could go search them through the portal and then download, instead of having to email the purchasing director who may be decent like the one we have, or maybe who extremely indecent and says it takes 3 weeks for me to produce for you a 3-page PDF that's just sitting on Joe Smith's computer. And so that's work that remains for this body to contemplate on how we're going to move into the 21st century for the purpose of records, because there's a lot of work that could be done. And I know I could probably check the pulse of one person in the back of the room for how are we going to actually do that, and their pulse has gone up a little bit because it's complicated, right? It's very complicated. What we have in our public records or our open records portal is just exports of tables from SAP, right? What if we could get it to the next level? Then you click a button and get that contract too. Then the public would not have to call and write in and waste everybody's time chasing down records that are inherently the public's, but we can't yet provide it to them because our technology is not up to the moment. Aaron.
I have a couple of questions. The first is, do we have any sort of baseline data on which departments receive records requests on a regular basis?
APD.
I mean, yeah.
Number
yes.
one.
APD receives the lion's share of all of the municipalities' public records requests, like by far. Like, it's not even
The
close.
chief is here because this impacts them more.
So we have APD, and then we have a space, and then who
My understanding
else?
is it's then like development services and purchasing are the other two big recipients.
And then us, yeah, and then us or the mayor's office, like, that's like, depends on where the tide is at. And so, but yeah, it's by far our friends in the police department. And then it really is a vast difference all the way down. Every department, like I said, some departments get so infrequent, they don't have a process to collect money or do anything. When they get one, they're like, huh, and they're begging in a plant, like, what do we do here? And the attorneys. And so but again, that was a policy choice to leave that.
I will refrain from using a Moneyball quote at this moment. Second question is, how does this interact with, I think there's a line in here, and now I have lost it, about folks who don't necessarily want a physical copy of something. They just want to view or see something. And I just want to be sure that we have that sort of option baked in here, particularly for folks who might not have access to the kind of technology that would allow them to say, view a video or something of that nature. Is there an option in here that allows for, I just want to look at something and then walk away?
Sure, I don't have any answer to that, I don't know.
Yeah, so first, the policy is to provide for inspection in an electronic format to the greatest extent feasible. The understanding being that the vast majority of everybody out there really wants that PDF, really wants the electronic copy of what they're asking for. If there are some records that we can't give over in electronic format, right, like giant maps. And so then you might actually have to come in and inspect. And I think that the come in and inspect option would be left to the individual discretion of the person administering the public records request for that department. And yeah, I think there's definitely room within this ordinance to have reasonable procedures for people to come and do that. Now, I would say that the reasonableness of the procedures is important there. And if someone wants to come in and take over an office to watch 10 hours of video, it doesn't sound to me like that's going to be an option, no matter how sad the person's story might be about not having, an ability to watch electronic video. I don't think that's a reasonable use of municipal time and resources.
Okay, anyone else? So, thank you. This is a complex project. I do recommend folks read through it. There's another big one introduced on the agenda relating to assembly procedures, which just codifies much of our practices, but it's a lot, so it's worth reading because these and that are going to be things that people are subject to for the near future. And any last words?
No, not for me.
So this will be before us on Tuesday. As I said, there might be some last minute slight modifications proposed. we'll know shortly whether that's the case. This will be back before us Tuesday, and I look forward to the hearing and getting this over the finish line. So if there's no one else, we'll stand adjourned. Thank you, everybody. And it's now the President's Day holiday weekend, starting 2 o'clock for at least our staff. So get out of here while you can.